Well, Jim Chalmers' budget promised cost of living relief for Australians, but not everyone is convinced that the government has done enough to help those who are struggling the most. The opposition says the government has failed to act in any meaningful way on inflation, power prices, housing, describing last night's budget as one of broken promises. Join me live now is the Finance Minister Jane Hume. Good to see you. What do you take exception with?
Well, before we start with that, Laura, I think I should probably correct you. I'm the shadow Finance Minister. As much as I would like to be the Finance Minister today, unfortunately, I'm the shadow Finance Minister.
Yeah. All right. So, that does change the dynamic quite a
bit. Somewhat.
All right, let's get into it. So what's your biggest problem with this budget?
Well, this is a traditional Labor budget. You know, it's a big tax, big spend budget. There's an additional $185 billion just in this year alone of additional expenditure. And of course, that means that this government isn't tackling inflation, which is the biggest driver of the cost of living. You know, inflation is the thief of the night. It erodes your purchasing power, it eats at your savings, it reduces your standard of living. So unless you're tackling inflation, essentially you're failing in your duty. And I know you've got Chris Richardson on, yes, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but last night his response to the budget, his immediate response was, well, you know, I thought that the RBA had probably finished its rate rises, but now it may well have to bring out, I think the phrase he used was the baseball bat again. And that's a real disappointment to those thousands, millions of Australians that are really struggling right now, those with mortgages who are essentially shouldering all the burden from those rate rises that the RBA is forced to make because the government isn't moving fiscal policy in the same way.
So you think this welfare spend is inflationary? If that is the case, who would you not have given that money to?
Well, this is the thing. You know, we're looking through the budget papers and every line says this isn't inflationary, but that's not enough. Is it actually reducing inflation? And if it is, well, where? Because we can't find a policy that has a sustained deflationary effect. And that should be an objective of this government. In fact, they've removed the explicit objective of maintaining or tackling inflation from the fiscal strategy. I think that's really disappointing. So we would have liked to have seen more. In fact, we're seeing some policies there that are potentially could push inflation higher for longer. So, for instance, there's a new tax on farmers, a biodiversity levy, and there's a new tax on truckies in a freight charge, a fuel charge. And because of that, you know, that's actually going to affect both agriculture and transport. And that's going to push the prices of food and groceries even higher. We haven't seen that modelled yet. That's certainly something that we will analyse a little further during the Senate estimates process. But those sorts of measures potentially have a more inflationary effect. That's not deflationary. That's not what this budget should be doing.
What about housing? Because, look, these budget papers show about 140,000 people are going to lose their jobs, perhaps in the next year, but we're also going to welcome about 700,000 migrants. That has the obvious problems, right? But the pressure on housing is huge. Is there any thinking there? I mean, there's an incentive for developers, build to rent, great. But does the coalition need to just support the government in any kind of way to get homes built more quickly?
Yeah, this is extraordinary. And in fact, you know, that 700,000 figure I think is an underestimate because when you look at the budget, you know, as a whole, in fact, it's 1.5 million in net migration in 5 years if you include this year as well. And of course, that comes at a time when infrastructure is either being delayed or being cut. So there isn't that supporting infrastructure behind that large migration growth. And as you said, housing, we're in a housing crisis already. Now, if I were in government at a federal level and at every state and territory level, other than Tasmania, well, the first thing that I would do is be asking those state premiers, what are you going to do to open up supply? The fact that Anthony Albanese hasn't been able to do that so far suggests to me that either the premiers are the ones that have all the power, or they're not respecting, or they're not respecting.
Don't the states have all the power?
Well, this is really it, isn't it? So, you know, surely if you're controlling that national cabinet the way Anthony Albanese should be, if he's delivering for all Australians, which is the promise that he made, that he wouldn't leave anybody behind, it's time to get those premiers in order to make sure that they're opening up supply. That is the only sustainable way to bring down the cost of housing. In the same way that opening up new supplies of energy is the only sustainable way for electricity and gas price decreases.
Okay, Jane Hume, thanks so much for your time this morning.